Hello, everyone, and welcome to Feeding the World. I'm David Perpich, head of standalone products here at the New York Times, which includes NYT Cooking. The food industry, traditionally labor-intensive from farm to shelf to table, has been upended by the pandemic. Many consumers have stopped eating out and shifted to cooking at home, while essential workers on the front lines have borne the risk of infection. Businesses have been forced to rethink their operations or close their doors altogether. According to one estimate, 1 in 6 restaurants has closed for the long term or closed for good. During the height of the pandemic, millions of gallons of milk were being thrown out by farmers and tons of produce, fresh produce, being thrown out due to supply and demand imbalances. And meanwhile, 1/3 of families with children here in the US are identified as food insecure. And the United Nations says that if the world faces the risk of a COVID-induced hunger pandemic. Now, today we're here to talk about all of this and how innovation and innovative thinking are aiming to rebalance the supply chain and increase its resilience to future shock. In a few minutes, we'll hear from 3 food industry veterans at the center of these efforts. First, our food reporter, Kim Severson, will be speaking with philanthropist and chef José Andrés, whose World Central Kitchen has partnered with local restaurants to serve up 25 million emergency meals to communities in need. And I should point out to our readers that they've helped support these efforts with contributions to Times Neediest Cases, which is an annual campaign that runs through the end of the year. Then, our on-tech writer, Shira Ovide, will be joined by Sara Menker, a former commodities trader whose company is leveraging data and AI to make agricultural markets more efficient and hopefully to help avoid the next food crisis. And joining as well will be Greg Lehmkuhl, head of cold storage giant that handles 1/3 of the country's food supply on its way to grocery shelves and delivery boxes. They'll talk about the lessons learned from the past year and how growers, shippers, and sellers are adapting to deal with an uncertain future. But first, it's my pleasure to invite Josh Mellinger, the fresh food supply chain leader at Deloitte, to welcome everyone to the program. Josh.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon and welcome to today's session. My name is Josh Mellinger and I am fresh food and sustainable supply chain leader at Deloitte Consulting. My team's goal is to bring innovative ideas and digital solutions to connect the food value chain in new ways, creating more profitable, transparent, and sustainable food. By doing this, we move the right food to the right places and we reduce food waste. We support the health of our planet, ecosystems, communities, businesses, and people. During my time at Deloitte, I've had the privilege of working side by side with the amazing people who grow, make, and move the food that we eat. I have witnessed their incredible dedication to keeping empty shelves and empty stomachs full and happy. And even though 2020, and more specifically the COVID-19 pandemic, which David talked about, has created its own set of supply chain complications, what most people frequently ask me about is how they can do more. They remember the food rotting in fields, while at the same time we had long lines of hungry people who were worried about where they would find their next meal. And we still do. See, scarcity of food is not a new concept. In fact, it's one of our oldest, and how we choose to collectively work together will shape our ability to feed the world. At Deloitte, we take a holistic approach to food. We believe that people are at the center of great solutions. The teaming gives us perspective to help solve the world's most challenging problems, and that together we can create a more responsible and efficient food supply chain for everyone. This is why Deloitte is honored to sponsor today's event and continue our collaboration with the New York Times in showcasing the issues that matter the most, so that we can catalyze change in the places that it's needed the most. The food is very personal. It is a fundamental part of who we are and where we have been. It is potentially a sign of where we are going. The stories of food are important because they are our stories, and they are everyone's stories. Today, you will hear from an incredible group of panelists who understand this. They understand the impact of building a better food system.
So I want to start by asking you about two problems that the pandemic seemed to expose about America's food system. And David alluded to this in the opening of his in his intro. The first was that experience that many of us had of stores running out of things like flour, or it seemed like cartons of eggs suddenly were far more expensive than we were used to. So first question goes to Greg. How did that happen, first? And second, is there anything that we should do differently with the United States food system to prevent those problems from happening again?
I think the first part's simple. Is there was a lot of fear in the world, and people basically ran the shelves for all staples, including flour, eggs, and other toilet paper and everything like that. So I think that piece of it's relatively simple. The one that was more publicized that might be more interesting to your listeners is the protein situation that you saw so much, that you read so much about and saw so much about on the news. On the meat side of things, not only was there an initial spike in demand, just like there was with toilet paper or eggs or flour, but because people could freeze that product, the demand was actually even higher than some of those other categories. The other thing that happened in April, if you look at the statistics looking back now, people actually bought 160% more freezers and refrigerators than they did a year earlier in the U.S. In parts of Europe, there was a 200+% surge in freezer sales. So there was actually a surge in supply or home supply or capacity as well. The other piece of the equation is while that demand was spiking for proteins and meats, the supply was being constricted due to the COVID outbreaks that you heard so much about. And so despite all of our customers, major advancements in automation in the meat processing plants, it's still a very manual environment in many cases where team members are working in very, very close proximity. And so I think, the bad news is certainly not everybody got the cut of meat they wanted or the pork chop that they wanted. But when you take a step back, although there were shortages, there was plenty of supply kind of overall in the food chain, because in the food chain, there's natural backup plan. I mean, in the food business, we're routinely preparing for demand shocks, like things like Thanksgiving or Christmas, where demand will spike up quite significantly. And if you think about things like turkeys, we are harvesting turkeys all year and storing them all over the country in order to satisfy that spike in demand that happens over the holidays. And so I think, overall, there were certainly interruptions, but in aggregate, people ate just fine, despite not being able to necessarily get exactly what they wanted.
Okay, and Sarah, I wonder if you would take on those same questions again. How did we have these sort of spot shortages, and what at least felt like price spikes? And is there anything that we should do differently with the food system in the United States to prevent that from happening again?
Yeah, I'll just touch on. I'll just build a little bit on what Greg already talked about a little bit. Price at the end of the day is a reflection of supply and demand, and sometimes you have supply shocks that lead to a spike in price, and sometimes you have a demand shock that leads to a spike in prices. And in this case, you had an unprecedented situation where you had both a supply shock and a demand shock happening simultaneously, which just meant that the reaction of price was that much more observable, especially in the protein cases, as Greg mentioned, and was it was not due to a lack of real supply in terms of underlying livestock, but it was just the supply chain itself had breaks that essentially caused this to happen. And ultimately, I think what we're seeing now is actually much more a reflection of more tempered demand, leading to prices being at below 5-year averages, right? And so now that things have normalized and supply chains are back to normal, protein prices it was almost like the A-shaped recovery. In China, what you ended up having when the pandemic hit was a V-shaped recovery where the price of proteins plummeted because it was mostly consumed in cafeterias and restaurants. And as it reopened, you saw the prices spiking again. In the US, it went in reverse, which was as the shutdown occurred, you had these bottlenecks in the supply chain that led to a price increase, and you saw the recovery occur with prices decreasing. But this is one of those rare situations where it's a supply and demand shock simultaneously happening. Now, in produce, in fresh produce, I think ultimately what we saw was an exacerbation of what I believe is still ultimately quite inefficient as a supply chain, and is reflected in the fact that prices in fresh produce are extremely volatile, even in normal years, not just this year. But all of us were paying attention this year, and so therefore everyone's reaction was that this must be the pandemic, when in reality it was actually a reflection of what was reality for fresh produce for such a long time.
And what do you think it means that produce prices are always so volatile? Is that just the nature of agriculture, or is there something more at work here?
No, I think it's fundamentally broken capital markets for our food systems as a whole. I mean, I think our food systems and the food security issues we face are really driven by a fact that capital in the food and agriculture markets is still very short term. If you think about other markets like oil, which is viewed as very volatile, the annualized price volatility of oil would be about 41%. S&P would be, say, 21%. When we looked at fresh produce, we looked at a sample of about 640 products across the US. Over 500 of them had volatility greater than 100%. So it just gives you the order of magnitude. And that means that when you have that much price volatility, nobody's making long-term decisions of any kind. We can make decisions that are 10, 20 years out in the energy industry, and in food and ag, especially in the produce space, we're still making decisions on a very short-term basis. And I think that this is a reflection of that. And if we want to fix the systems, that's one of the questions we have to start addressing, is how do we move capital in that space so it's much more longer term?
Yeah, and I wonder, Greg, if you would address that, because it feels like there's an area, I think, fundamental disagreement between you and Sara on this point, that I think part of what you're saying, Greg, is that there is a lot of resiliency built into the food supply system. And there's sort of, as you said, turkey, you substitute turkey for pork or whatever. And I think Sara's pointing out what she sees as a, structural problem in global agriculture, right? Both on this kind of financing side and elsewhere that makes prices much more volatile. So I wonder how you tackle that.
Yeah, I would probably weigh in on the side is that's just kind of the nature of the agricultural business. I mean, our customers have built responsive and agile supply chains. So, we operate in 60 of the largest ports in the world, and our customers are real time deciding where to export, when to export, how much inventory to hold based on those commodity prices. And I think it's basically efficient markets at work, and everybody making decisions best for their own needs or companies.
Okay, let me ask you again the point that David raised in the introduction about food insecurity, right? Which is another problem that we've seen even in an affluent country like the United States, where there's not an issue necessarily with food supply, but there is an issue where people are going hungry at levels that maybe we haven't seen before. Is there anything that you think needs to be changed either on the policy side or in the private markets that you think could address food insecurity, both now and on a permanent basis? Sara, sorry, I'll throw this to you first. Apologies.
I think both Greg and I were hoping the other one was going to start off. Yeah, you're absolutely right in that food availability does not necessarily translate to food security for all, right? And that's food security is a question of equity and equality. And it's also just not about, again, it's not just about food security in the context of do you have food or not? It's do you have access to nutritious foods at affordable prices, which is almost a layer that is as important to start addressing than, can we get food in the hands of people? Because if it's not nutritious, then you have other health problems that emerge. And so I think from a policy standpoint, it's very complicated if there's domestic and there's international, and the set of the set of issues are very different in terms of what the US faces from a food security standpoint than, say, what countries in sub-Saharan Africa are facing from a food security standpoint. Where there, it's also an availability question, and what's available not being nutritious enough. Whereas here, there's an abundance of food, but the markets and the distribution of that food and the pricing of that food make it inaccessible. And so to me, from a policy standpoint, it's also about prioritizing nutrition as much as food, and prioritizing access, right? So it's how do you start to structure markets such that affordability of nutritious food the cost can go down. And I really fundamentally believe that markets are good at solving that problem when capital is available to them on a long-term basis. These are not very easy problems to solve on a dime or in a day, right? And they're structural issues. And I have always believed that the way that you structurally solve for these is by innovation. And innovation takes money and capital in a real sense. And in the food and ag space, the capital we see going into that and financing it is still significantly less than kind of the reality that it touches on every single human being's life every single day of our lives. And yet it's fundamentally, I think, still a highly underfunded industry on a relative basis. So there's a role that policy plays, but I think there's a role that capital markets and finance plays, and that only happens, I think, as you start to build an equal playing field for that to occur and for risk to be transferred across space and time. So,
Greg, would you like to tackle food insecurity, your 5-point plan for fixing a global problem here?
Sure. So first of all, I agree with everything Sarah said. I mean, during this pandemic, it was not an availability problem; it was an affordability problem more than anything. And our hearts go out to everybody who's food insecure. Even in a country like the U.S. or the U.K., where we're so relatively rich, there's millions of people that are food insecure on a day-to-day basis every single day of the year. And when unemployment spiked, that pushed millions more over that line and created a real crisis. And the short-term safety net is the food banks and organizations, great organizations like Feeding America. But what you saw in their case is not only did you see that amazingly high surge in demand, but you also saw a very much constrained workforce, which constrained the supply of food that the food banks were donating, because a significant portion of food bank workers are elderly, and obviously they were the most susceptible during the pandemic. So that created a real crisis. And you ask what needs to change. I think a lot of things need to change structurally, policy wise, but people need to just step up and help here in the short term. I mean, in March we stood up and said, we've been a longtime partner of Feeding America. We pledged to donate 100 million free meals to those that are food insecure by partnering with our customers, our suppliers, even sports celebrities like Steph Curry and Aisha Curry with their Eat, Learn, and Play program in Oakland, California. We were able to give a very significant donation there, as well as around the country and around the world. But it's going to take, we have to address the social wealth equity issue. And it's going to take an overall partnership between individuals, between companies, between state, local, federal, global governments, and nonprofits working together to make this something that we're not just addressing during a pandemic, but something that we're addressing more systemically and every day of the year.
Greg, let me stick with you for a question about food consumption patterns. That one change that we saw during the last few months is more people getting groceries delivered or using e-commerce a lot for food staples rather than shopping in stores. Is that a permanent change, do you think? And if so, Is there anything that we need to do differently in how food is grown, packaged, and moved around to accommodate that change?
So we were right in the middle of that. I mean, we had buildings that were 500-person buildings that were seeing 200% spikes in demand because of the shift from physical stores and the food service sector to the e-commerce retail sector. And so, that obviously had a massive impact on us and was a very, very significant kind of fundamental shift. Long term, we feel that, physical store consumption will come back to a certain extent, But more generally, this shift to e-commerce is permanent as the older generation got comfortable buying online and likely will not go back to the way they used to purchase retail products. And so really all this did is accelerate a trend that was already very much in motion for years to come. And we think this will just benefit the well-capitalized, retailers that already have a strong web presence. But, at the end of the day, whether it's e-commerce or whether it's physical brick and mortar or whether it's restaurants, people are going to consume about the same amount of calories this year as they did last year. And so 90% of the food chain will remain unchanged. It's really just that final mile to the consumer that's seeing a pretty substantial change. So, for example, we're seeing the development of dark stores in major metro markets to facilitate the more efficient distribution of product from that kind of final step in the food chain to the customer's doorstep.
That makes sense. Okay. I'm going to go to audience questions in just a minute. So I'm just going to have just a lightning round question, one for each of you. So start with Sara. What is your favorite comfort food and why?
Oh, my favorite comfort food. So I was born and raised in Ethiopia. And so my favorite comfort food is called katenya. And it's basically made on a bread called injera, which is a flatbread that we use. It's made of an indigenous grain called teff, which is highly nutritious. But then we put that in the oven with spiced butter and more spices on it. And so it's basically toasted bread with lots of butter and spice. But that is my ultimate comfort food. So every time I go back to Ethiopia, my mom knows that the first thing I need to eat as soon as I arrive home is that.
Okay, I'm going to search NYT cooking to see if we have recipes for that. That sounds great. Yeah. And Greg, what about you? Do you have a favorite comfort food?
If I'm watching sports on a Sunday afternoon, I try to avoid the pizza and chicken wings, and I'll have a massive relish tray with about 4 different kinds of pickles, 7 or 8 different kinds of hot peppers, olives, and okra or something like that. It's a weird comfort food, but I've been doing it for years. So.
That's great. So I'm going to go to some of the questions from the audience. I think they're good ones. First, Emma asked about vertical farming, sort of indoor vertical farming. And for people who don't know, this is the process of generally growing foods indoors in these kind of highly mechanized environments with kind of carefully calibrated sunlight and water. So Sara, if you want to tackle that question about the feasibility of vertical farming and the impact on the supply chain and prices.
Yeah, so vertical farming, is a booming kind of industry, and you're hearing a lot more about vertical farms emerging, both in the U.S. but also outside of the U.S. The viability depends on the city, and it goes back to affordability. Meaning, right now, produce that comes out of vertical farms is fresh, it's delicious, but it's actually still quite expensive, even on a relative basis in the supermarket shelf. There's also, if you think of food as, a system, there's only a subset of food that can still grow in a vertical farm. So we can do this with leafy greens. We're not going to be seeing rice fields in vertical farms or, corn or, so we'll have some produce move into vertical farming and others not. And, you'll have the viability will also, in terms of affordability, will as these companies grow and they get scale, the prices should start to drop, and you've started to see that. But, to me, the big question for vertical farming is still ultimately affordability. So can we get this affordable for everybody? That's the big outstanding question. And so it will work in some markets, and in other markets it won't, because it just will still be too expensive.
The James Beard Foundation, they're teaching a whole generation of chefs that it's not just enough to cook amazing, beautiful food. It's the decisions you make behind the food that are so important.
When we talk about the ability to see where we're going as an industry, I don't think you can, but I think you have to pave that way and how you feel it's right.
The future of food is transparency. You're going to want to know where your food comes from,
as a chef, it's your responsibility to make sure that where you're getting product is properly sourced.
How do you know if something is humanely raised or thoughtfully produced? You don't know. I think we're getting to a ceiling with that where it's going to break, and that's what I believe is going to change.
This is, for those of you who don't know, this is Chef José Andrés. José Andrés, a cook, as he likes to say. And I'm Kim Severson. I'm a food correspondent for the Times, and we're going to talk about feeding America. For those who don't know, Jose started World Central Kitchen in 2010 as a way to help Haiti after a devastating earthquake there. The idea was to feed people through the eyes of a chef. So you fed people and you taught them to cook as part of the program there. You have a unique lens on the food crisis and the way we get food to people who need it. I watched your efforts with World Central Kitchen firsthand during a reporting trip I made to Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria, and we spent time together, and I think you served nearly 4 million meals there. And now your attention has turned to feeding America. And you're doing it, as you do all of this work, with the nation's community of cooks. I saw your cooks were just here in Georgia, where I'm based, feeding people in the voting lines. You fed crews that were stuck on cruise ships. But most significantly, World Central Kitchen and some other foundations created what was essentially a WPA-style feeding program. Restaurants shut down. There were cooks who needed jobs. You all got those cooks cooking emergency relief meals in the restaurants that were closed. And I think 8 of your restaurants in DC and New York did that. How did you pivot so quickly to feed people in that way?
Thank you, Kim. Yeah, my restaurants did it, but for the record, I didn't got $1 for any one of my restaurants. My partners and I, we took care of everything we did in our restaurant, just to be very clear. But this is very simple. A lot of people, I was able to close my restaurants on March 14th. That was the right thing to do. I was following this pandemic very closely. We began answering to it in Japan when we went there to feed 6,000 people in Yokohama in the Princess cruise ship. And we were following this very closely. When I closed March 14th is because I saw this was the only way forward. I had to protect our teams. But next day we reopened as what we call community kitchens. So very much we created the blueprint of what became the bigger effort. Many people had praises for what we did, saying, wow, brilliant. You've been able to use restaurants to feed people. And me, I will roll my eyes and say, brilliant. I will say it's very practical. If you have the entire restaurant industry shut down and you have hundreds of thousands of hungry people in the streets, in hospitals, elderly homes, who do you use? The workers in a nuclear facility? No, you use cooks to feed people that are hungry. So very much we did that. We proved that works. Obviously, we spend more money than if we will do it other ways, but was not spending money, was investing, making sure restaurants were running. They could pay the salaries, they could pay the farmers, they could pay the leases, they could keep moving forward. And then at the same time, we were able to take care of the people in need. And more important, we were able to prove a concept. So we pushed for a bill which passed Congress, bipartisan support. In these moments, it's difficult to get anything bipartisan, but we got the FEED Act that was simply that, to get the government to, through FEMA, to support mayors and governors, to activate restaurants, to take care at the local level of the feeding needs that they will have through a pandemic like this and beyond. So far, it's in Congress passed. We are waiting for the Senate, but you know how these things are going these days.
Right. So now how are you funding this until government money comes in? I mean, how are you paying all the cooks?
Well, if I will have to be waiting for the government, we will still be waiting. Obviously, this is only one of the many things we've been doing. but it's not only restaurants, it's food trucks. And obviously, New York Times has helped us raise money. We had a lot of individuals giving us $1. We had other individuals like Mayor Bloomberg that he supported us a big way. All the hospitals we were feeding during months in New York, all across New York City and beyond, was with support of Mayor Bloomberg. In Oakland, that I know we've been talking about, Aisha and Steve Curry, we've been there leading next to their foundation, the Curry's Foundation. It played, and we've been able to put many restaurants in Oakland, but the same all across. We've been in more than 40 states. So thanks to the people, for the people, because the people, they see what we do in real time. And this has worked very well for us. People, they understand that when you have an emergency, and especially when you talk about food and water, the urgency of now is yesterday. People cannot wait for a month to be fed. And the people that like action, they support organizations like ours, that we can always prove that we can respond to every event quicker and faster than anybody else.
Yeah, let's talk about how that played out in Puerto Rico a little bit. So you went down and immediately got just basically a buddy who was a chef and another chef, and you started making rice and did some different dishes down there to feed them. And then you found some food truck operators who didn't have any work, and you got them involved and they started delivering it. So you were giving people hot meals like almost immediately after the hurricane hit. FEMA, meanwhile, was, as I recall, getting boxes of, crackers and Slim Jims and cases of water that were still warehoused. What if you were king of the universe, which many of us think you are, but if you were really king of the universe, how would FEMA be changed in those immediate emergencies? Not a long-term pandemic, but when there's that wildfire, the hurricane, the tornado.
Listen, FEMA does a lot of things well, but they should do more of the things they do well and move away from the things they don't do so well. Many of the things that happen through FEMA, they need partners, they need other people. And for example, every time I've been to a hurricane, you will see that some of the companies that fix all the electric systems, you will see hundreds and hundreds of trucks. And they will be actually super good in organizing the reconstruction of all the electric grid. Those electric companies are unbelievable. They are very good at that. Obviously, FEMA empowers them to do what they do. FEMA pays for the rebuilding, and this usually happens very quickly. The issue with food is this. Puerto Rico, I may say, that was different situation. We came after 2-3 hurricanes. It's true that Puerto Rico is an island, and it's true that this hurricane was one of the most powerful hurricanes we've seen in recent memory. But at the end of the day, it doesn't take so long to do certain things. Let's see what happened in Puerto Rico. We double the milk output every single day. From 2000 to 4 to 8, 816, 32, 64, 120. How we did this? Understanding that the urgency of now when it's about food and water is yesterday. And how we did it, understanding what the resources are available to us. If you are trying to bring bread from Florida, when you have 4 bakeries in the island, it's not smarter to find some generators, give the generators to the bakeries in Puerto Rico itself, and make sure that they produce bread locally without having to be coming with the infrastructure to bring the bread from Florida? That is going to be almost impossible. This is what World Central Kitchen does. The smarter solution to respond to what every member of World Central Kitchen knows. We feed the hungry and we bring water to the thirsty. When? Now. And they do anything that is possible within their possibilities to accomplish that. Simplicity of the mission equals higher possibilities of success. I think we expect too much from FEMA. People are highly confused what FEMA should be doing. And at certain levels is miscommunication in the expectations of what FEMA does and what the local states or local governments do. I think more clarity in what everybody does will help FEMA to be more successful on behalf of all the American people, because we badly need a FEMA that is effective from day one after any emergency.
So now let's move back to the United States, and you've seen the hunger and the need up close on the front lines, and I only see the numbers getting stronger and stronger, 40% increases at local food banks, feeding programs that just can't sustain, and it feels like it's getting worse. There are more people who've never had to use emergency food before. So from your perch, how do we do in this country in feeding people? Our food system, our emergency feeding systems were set up as that, emergencies. And for 50 years, we've built it as if it was an emergency. But this is now long-term hunger in this country. What are you seeing out there in the field, and where do we go in terms of this incredible hunger crisis we're facing right now?
I believe that one of the main problems we face is that the top leadership in the country has not really recognized we have a humanitarian crisis. Before even we were listening about the pandemic, we were talking about the economic crisis, which I understand, but actually the economic crisis happened because the health crisis through the pandemic. The third one that really was important was the humanitarian food crisis. And this is not only happening in America, but this is happening around the world. So number one, by recognizing that you have the problem, then you can take action to make it happen. And the way to do this is in a 360 degrees, three-dimensional approach. It's many things that we don't need to reinvent to keep providing meals to people in need. The school lunch program can always be better. The quality of the food we serve the children can always be better. But because already we have pre-approved money through the USDA school lunch or the breakfast, why we don't use those same schools like it happened in some states to make sure that children can still keep getting their food, even in a moment that everybody stopped going to schools. But then you are quick and smart and you add extra funds. So if the children are hungry, chances are that they come from a poor family. Therefore, that family needs your help. Why we don't use every school through moments like this to make sure that we are not only able to feed the children, but feed the entire family unit. This is something like we were supposed to be doing more of it. And we kind of fell short. Even lately, USDA has been approving more funds. Feeding America. How is that many banks, food banks in America were lacking food, and even more, they didn't have any money to buy more? How this happened when already we have these food banks all across the United States, and is another way that we can make food get to people. Food stamps, what we know technically as SNAPs. Why we don't increase the number that every American get on the SNAPs, but why we don't also increase the possibilities of the places they can access food? Why we don't let the SNAPs to be used in diners, in small food trucks all across America, so people can have access to food, putting money into the economy too. As you see, why we don't put restaurants to work like what we've been doing, and why we don't make sure that then small NGOs at the local level are the ones in partnership with the mayors get everywhere that needs food. We saw that the USDA in partnership with the Bank of Trump and the White House, they did something called Farmers to Families. This was a good idea. Actually, in one New York Times op-ed that you gave me guys the opportunity to write, it's one of the many ideas I was putting about how to respond, but was good for PR, politically speaking, but was not done very well at the ground level. So what we need is all of those things working as one, making sure that food deserts, that food access becomes an opportunity instead of a problem. We can do it. I hope, unfortunately, this pandemic will show the weaknesses of the system of feeding America. And in the months and years to come, our legislators, our leaders will once and for all put food at the center so we don't go through moments like this with more Americans going hungry and creating more problems than finding solutions.
We've got some questions I'm going to kind of work in here as we continue our conversation. And one of them is about how important is locally sourced foods to keeping communities fed, from Sandra. And this also kind of fits into this other notion of that's always been a struggle in when you have the the sort of good food, new foods, sustainable organic food movement and the hunger movement. Is a calorie just a calorie? Do we just get whatever food we can to poor people? Or does that need to be quality calories? Does it need to be fruits, vegetables? Or when you're really hungry, you know, a box of mac and cheese is a box of mac and cheese and that'll fill your belly. So let's talk about locally sourced food and how important that is. Is that chain getting stronger in the pandemic? And then is a calorie just a calorie when it comes to feeding the hungry?
Wow. These, after this, I'm going to give one class at George Washington, which I've been doing for 8 years. So this takes us an entire semester to explain. Let me see here in 2-3 minutes how I'm able to go, because there's many questions at once. I think we're living in a moment that local needs to be embraced, but that doesn't mean that we should not be embracing global. We shouldn't be making them fight one against each other. We need to make sure that we have a very strong local system everywhere we can, and understanding that also is going to be certain areas of the world that they are going to be able to be producing more foods. Therefore, it's vital that the local structures of producing food are as strong as we can be, so we don't have any issues of what is one of the main issues that sometimes is about distribution. If we are able to produce in planet Earth as much food as anybody can eat, even more, but still we have a lot of people that are hungry, is not because we have a production problem. What we have is a distribution problem and preservation of those goodness of the earth problem. We have the technology to preserve the food we produce. We have the technology to deliver anything we want. So why once and for all we don't try to transform this problem into a solution? So in America, we need to have a strong local systems, but I will say also around the world. And I need to bring it with something very recent. I applaud the Nobel Peace Prize to be given to the World Food Program. There's many great women that they've done an amazing job, and thanks to their work, many people eat around the world. But we also need to understand that ways we've been providing food relief has sometimes created more problems than solutions. When we came to Haiti with free rice from USAID, we put out all the farmers producing rice in Haiti out of business, and we put them into poverty. Why? Because we dumped everything for free. When we left and Haiti had to start importing rice, they had to import more expensive rice. People couldn't afford it, more hunger, more poverty. The rich countries of the world should be the ones leading the way in making sure that they feed their citizens, but also they come with the systems to don't make poor countries poorer in the process of helping them. We need to find systems that will make those countries richer, strengthening their farming output, and making sure that then together with a local mentality in a global strategy, we are able to feed everybody around the world.
I think that's completely sometimes overlooked, the idea that people want to just come give people food, and it does not help the structure. It's the same thing you saw in Puerto Rico too, where you could put to work people who were there and unemployed. We have about 8 minutes left, so please keep your questions coming, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. Thank you for doing that. I can't I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about the restaurant business a little bit. Ideally, the HOPE Act has got some money for restaurants. Like you say, we don't know if that's coming through, but how are your friends surviving? How are you surviving? What's happening?
Well, when I began this pandemic, we had 1,600 family team member of people in my restaurant company. Right now, we have right up under 400. So for you to understand, I've been able to keep on work close to 25% only. And this breaks my heart in every way and form. Obviously, we need to fight the pandemic. We need to make sure that we all are able to beat this pandemic. simple things like mask and everything else, we know it works. I cannot believe that everybody in America doesn't agree about this simple way of moving forward, because it's the only way we're going to go back sooner rather than later to normal way, because the vaccines, I'm telling you, they're not coming anytime soon, as some people are claiming. So we have, obviously, a bill. I've been part with many other chefs, as you know, and you in your newspaper, they talk about it, the Independent Restaurant Coalition, which is more than 500,000 restaurants that we've been asking help from the government in a way that makes sense and not in the way that PPP did it. I got PPP, but still I don't know if it's going to be something that is going to benefit me or not in the long term. Believe me what I'm telling you. Times ahead for me are hard, but for others, I know they are going to be even harder. Restaurant Act has passed in Congress with bipartisan support, has support in the Senate, bipartisan too, but for some reason the Senate is not willing or able to act. So if we don't get this, which is we've been requesting $120 billion for the restaurant industry, the restaurant industry is not going to look the same. Even 6 months from now is going to be very different from the restaurant industry we knew only 7-8 months ago.
Do you think it's safe to go eat at restaurants now? Is that the best way we can support restaurants?
I've been having a few conversations looking at Dr. Fauci. I don't know if you know, but I hosted a talk with Dr. Fauci because nobody was telling us. This is what World Central Kitchen did back in February, March. We developed Maskey, which was this guy who will tell us exactly how to behave. This was in February. By March, we had this printed and giving it to anybody that wanted. Here, by March, when the CDC barely was telling us anything, even in April, we developed all the strategies of what to do in the restaurants to keep our team safe, to keep our guests safe, and to keep the people delivering the food safe. In my company, we have a lot of people and family members. We had few cases, but it was handled very well. This was even before we were open. But all across of the 3,000 restaurants we had, we barely had any case. Why? Because everybody from the beginning took very seriously the mask, took very seriously the gloves, took very seriously in the kitchens to keep distance. We kept very seriously keeping the same teams. So if something happened, you could quarantine entire team. I've been in so many hospitals. The men and women of World Central Kitchen, we've been in so many hospitals. We've been in so many countries. I just was in Lebanon, in Beirut, helping feed the amazing volunteers that came to the streets and first responders to start cleaning all the streets of Beirut after the explosion. We've been in so many states. I have a team now in Mexico. We have teams now feeding people in the polls. Why we've been able to be so lucky of not getting major COVID cases between all the members of World Central Kitchen? Because we've been taking everything seriously. Even when we go together in a car, we all wear masks with the open windows. This is what we've been doing. So let's hope that everybody keeps doing this, because I think we can beat it if we will do fairly basic things in the way we behave with each other. So yes, I believe restaurants are safe. Mine, I only keep 30% inside the restaurant for giving extra precaution for my teams first, for the guests second, and I'm knocking on wood. I believe this way we can keep everybody healthy and everybody safe and keep looking like we're going back to normal until the next spring shows up.
All right, well, so there we go. So if we just follow the precautions, we know how to keep each other safe, right? So I have we have just a couple minutes left. One question, someone asks, and this is from Adrian, and several people have asked, what can they, as either a non-professional chef or a retired chef or someone who wants to help, how can they help Feed America right now? What's your advice if someone wants to volunteer?
Well, in the old days, 7 months ago, volunteering was hard because nobody wanted to go out. Feeding America was having issues finding volunteers. Many NGOs that they rely sometimes in older citizens, they were having a lot of issues. Now we know that we can keep ourselves safe if we do certain things. So it's plenty of organizations at the local level. Obviously, World Central Kitchen, in the way we operate is very different than, for example, Red Cross. I will say join Red Cross. They have a volunteer system that is much more organized. We have it organized, but what happened, the way we work is very much here, right now. We activate today. We don't need you 3 days later. And if you are following us, you will find ways to partner with World Central Kitchen. Feeding America, go to your local food bank. They need help. Also, by ordering to go from any restaurant that you can afford in your neighborhood, you are helping Feed America because you are keeping people employed. Therefore, people are doing something. They are getting a salary. This is good. Ordering from farms online, you are keeping rural America employed because you are ordering from them. It's many little gestures that all of us we can do to make sure that the entire system of food production doesn't end. The biggest miss we had, President Trump has spent $45 billion to pay farmers across America, sometimes used to dump milk and dump food, because his failure with the Chinese war he had about economics, in the biggest moment that America is supposed to be producing food, not only to feed America, but to keep the world in need fed, we spent $45 billion almost to don't produce anything so Trump can get a vote. We need to change completely. Food needs to become a national security issue, needs to be taken more seriously than what we are doing. One day we're going to have a big hunger issue, not only in America, but in the world. And if we don't start making decisions now, later it'll be way too late. Let's bring food to the higher level of the White House. Let's make positions that only will handle food as the same way we handle any issue around the world. Food is a national security issue. Let's make sure we give the importance it deserves.
Chef, thank you. Always, anytime I get to spend with you, I learn things, makes my heart bigger. So I appreciate you being with us, and I appreciate you being a supporter of the New York Times. And thank you. I think we're headed, get up there. We're headed back now. Thanks everyone for joining. I think we have a few parting words. That's word from the booth, a few parting words, and thanks everybody for tuning in. Thank you, Chef.
Thank you.
All right, that was great. I'd like to welcome Linda Pachak, who serves as Deloitte's Global and U.S. Consulting Blockchain and Digital Assets Leader, as well as the Global Cloud Financial Services Industry Leader. These were great conversations, Linda. And the thing to me that really struck me that was so great is actually the juxtaposition of the two panels, where one was really about the role that technology can actually play, particularly around distribution. But also, with what José Andrés was saying, the value of just the local infrastructure, the low-tech stuff that could just be activated, and that kind of really across both, it's about, a smarter allocation of capital and investing in the right things. And I'd be interested maybe just to start, kind of what was your takeaway? What stood out for you listening to these panels?
David, thank you. And thank you for having me. I think you're spot on in that wrap up. And as I was summarizing as well from the earlier conversation with Greg and Sara too, there are some very simple things in play, yet those simple things are quite complex because they require policy. As we look at certain things related to technology, by way of example, in developed nations, we've driven tremendous efficiency into our distribution networks and supply chains. And in fact, what we've witnessed is fragility of those supply chains that we've driven so efficiently. Clearly, the pandemic, unpredicted by most, but stressed every facet, everything from the grower or the producer to the distribution channel. We consumed and we've driven through things like technology, like just in time. We've driven towards a supply in a retail store of something less than 10 days, depending upon the actual SKU itself. But the complexity is in that 10-day period during COVID, we consumed 60 plus day supply of the inventory that was on the shelf, clearing out virtually everything off the shelf. So while we've driven over the years to great efficiency, using technology to help us do that for better insights, using analytics, for better supply demand calculations driven through great ERP systems and distribution systems. As Greg talked about, all of the ports throughout the world. And we're not only dealing with the inbound and export of product, but we also have to consider, which has become extremely important given the pandemic, and that is food safety. So we've layered on and have use of great technology, but it comes down to things like policy. It comes down to things like organizing around a structure, as Jose mentioned, supporting the local farmer whilst at the same time using broader ecosystems that are far-reaching beyond just the borders of a country.
You said something there I want to go back to, which is food safety. And, we talk a lot about, you hear a lot about freshness and the importance of, locally grown, basically all the different kind of words that people are focusing on in the food industry. Can you just talk about what actually consumers are focused on now? I mean, especially at this time during the pandemic, I imagine maybe it's shifting perspectives or maybe not at all.
Yeah, what's actually fascinating about food safety taken in this moment in time, if we look at some statistics that say 9 in 10 shoppers shop at their local market, mostly in the spirit of buying fresh food. Fresh food makes them happy. The access to fresh food is very positive. But as the pandemic underway, actually not only changed that statistic, but 54% of those people actually want to find safety within their shopping experience. Now, that means a couple things. The actual buying process being safe while shopping, but it also means, as was mentioned earlier, it was one of the advertisements is around the sourcing of food. Where is food coming from? So not only do we care about its freshness, but we care about its source. There's a lot of great solutions out there, technology enabled, particularly in more developed nations, that give us insights to food freshness. And in fact, some things that even my colleague Josh has worked on, but a great company, IBM, who's been working on their transparent supply blockchain network that looks explicitly at what used to take 7 days around the source of something that could be a bacteria-driven problem within the context of its leafy greens can now be detected and identified back to its original source in 2.5 seconds. The good news is when we look at things like using better data and using technologies that could be available to us to give us the insights we need to make safe decisions. If we look at it more broadly, though, think about the food processing and packaging process. So even where that, let's say that ingredient is sourced from, let's pick, something like something very important like baby food. Is that product not only being sourced legitimately? Is it stable? Is it being sourced in a sustainable fashion? But as things like new proteins come about, can you source the origin of that as you are now starting to integrate ingredients? That becomes not just the grower's challenge, but it becomes the processor's challenge too. So things like blockchain technology, clearly in Greg's world, IoT in terms of distribution becomes an important part of the stability of product, as well as understanding its longevity and its freshness, which all attributes back to safety.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Linda. And thanks to our speakers and moderators for being with us today. And of course, to our audience for joining. Today's event is part of a series we are presenting about the transformation of key sectors during the pandemic and the role of technology in propelling those changes. Stay tuned for details on the next discussion, December 10th, on the state of the entertainment industry. We hope to see you then. Thank you.